At 6:52 in the evening on the 19th of January 1917, London experienced the biggest explosion it would ever see. It's known as the Silvertown explosion, and it took place in a factory that had been converted to produce explosives for the First World War. A century ago, Silvertown was an incredibly busy area. It's industrial, but it's also residential. It's centred around the Royal Docks, which were one of the biggest dock complexes in London. Around the Royal Docks were a series of factories and food processing sites. So they were making things like chemicals, and they were also producing flour in flour mills. Silvertown was a really industrial area, but also there were about 3,000 people living within a quarter of a mile of the factory that exploded. There were community centres, there were schools. You would never normally put an explosives factory in the middle of this bustling community. But the First World War was so intense, it required so many explosives that the Ministry of Munitions had to look at sites they wouldn't normally consider. The First World War has a massive impact on the lives of Londoners in a way that no conflict had before. This was an explosion that came in the middle of the community, on the ground. It wasn't a threat from above. It wasn't clearly the Germans who'd done it. So it was something that they hadn't experienced before and didn't quite know how to cope with, despite all of the hardship they'd already gone through. The explosion happened in the Brunner Mond chemical factory. It had been converted from its usual use, which was producing caustic soda, and changed into producing TNT. To purify TNT, you have to heat it up, and that is incredibly dangerous. The building where it was done was known as the danger building, and that itself was flattened, as was every structure within a few hundred metres. Beyond that, we know that 60 to 70,000 buildings were damaged by the explosion. Across London, there was an orange glow that continued for hours because of the blazing fires. Even as far as Norwich, as Cambridge, people could feel this explosion. 73 people died and over 400 were injured, so everyone in Silvertown would have known someone who was either killed or hurt in this explosion. The trauma stayed with people, and especially the youngest, the children, found it really difficult to cope with, to understand and to feel safe again. So around 400 were sent to the countryside to recuperate, to get well and to really feel like they could go back to their homes. Because it was wartime and the information was sensitive, the details of the explosion were kept secret. What that meant was that there was wild speculation about what had caused it. So anything from an invisible Zeppelin that had bombed the plant to German sabotage. There was a real sense that the Germans must be to blame for this, that it couldn't just be an accident. And what that meant was that any Germans in the area, German businesses, suffered the consequences. Despite all the secrecy at the time, we know now that this was the biggest explosion that London's ever seen. And we also know that, despite all the speculation, this was just a tragic accident. Some First World War stories are much better known, things like the trench warfare of the Western Front or the bombing that London suffered at that time. But despite the Silvertown explosion being the largest single explosion that London has ever seen, it remains a little known story to this day.